Lovely. So everybody is almost in. Awesome. Okay. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's expert panel. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I hand you over to our speakers this evening, I'd just like to first reiterate some of the information that I mentioned in the email which you were sent earlier with your link to tonight's event. So because we are such a big group tonight, which is fantastic, you've all been placed on mute automatically just to avoid any potential background noises disrupting the conversation this evening. However, I will unmute you all at the end so that you can join me in thanking our speakers. But because of this, for our Q&A session, I'll invite you to send questions to me using the chat box. If you can't see it, it's towards the bottom left of your screen. If you type your question there, it will come straight through to me, and then I'll read your question out along with your name when I'm prompted to do so later on in the evening. So please start sending those through to me as you think of them, so that we've got plenty when we get to the Q&A session. I would also like to mention that we have a special promotion on this evening for everybody who's in attendance. If you use the code EVENT at checkout on our website, then you will receive 10% off all books ordered within the next 24 hours. So I'll be posting the link to purchase your copy of Split shortly, as soon as I hand over to Cass. So I recommend that you get in quick and make most of that 10% offer in the next 24 hours. So that's enough from me. I'd now like to introduce your host for the evening, Cass Moriarty. Cass is author of The Promised Seed and Parting Words, an avid reviewer, a keen reader, and co-host of Brisbane Literary Mafia, which is an avid reader event which Cass runs alongside Chrissy Neen, and it takes place on the last Monday of each month. So I will post a link to for you to all register for that event as well. It has, Cass and Chrissy have phenomenal guest speakers. So if you enjoy tonight's event, I'm sure that you will absolutely love that event too. So that's all from me. Cass, I would now like you to take it from here.
Thank you, Emma Kate. Welcome everybody. We've got about 130 people booked in for tonight, which is an amazing number. So let's get started. I want to welcome you all to another Avid Reader online Zoom event, bringing together readers, writers, and the literary community. I also would like to acknowledge that the traditional owners of this country have been storytelling and celebrating stories for thousands of years, as we're doing tonight. And I particularly acknowledge that the Turrbal and Yagara people on this land in Brisbane, and recognise all elders and their continuing connection to the land, both here and wherever you may be on country in Australia. In these COVID times, social media is keeping authors, publishers and booksellers thriving. So if you enjoy tonight's event, please spread the word or buy a book or follow our authors on social media and help support the writing community. So tonight I'm thrilled to be wrangling a panel of talented authors who have each contributed to the collection of personal essays entitled Split, with this fabulous cover. Stories about leaving, loss, vulnerability and transformation, which was recently longlisted for the ABA Awards. I'll introduce them first individually. Lee Kofman is a well-known author of memoir, non-fiction and short works, and often writes about bodies and emotions. Not only is Lee the editor of this collection, but she is also a contributor. Ramona Koval is a writer, journalist and editor, and the author of several non-fiction books. From 1987 until 2011, she worked at the ABC on programs such as The Book Show. And Kate Holden, our third guest, is a writer, journalist and editor, and the author of several... Oh, sorry. Sorry, mistake. Kate regularly writes for national newspapers and literary publications, and she has written 2 memoirs, In My Skin and The Romantic. All three authors have new books coming out this year or in 2021, so I hope to hear about them a little later in the evening. And I also want to mention that we have two of the other contributors to the anthology in the audience tonight, Kate Goldsworthy and Virginia Peters. So a big shout out to both of you as well, because both of your contributions to this book are also very, very good. So a big avid welcome to you all. Now, we can't really start the event without addressing the elephant in the room, which is, of course, the Victorian lockdown, which has gotten very serious very quickly. Ramona and Lee, you're both in Melbourne, as I'm sure a number of our viewers are tonight. So during our discussion tonight, please feel free to incorporate your feelings on how you think an anthology such as Split resonates with readers at a time of such extraordinary change, such as we've seen over the last 6 months. I think that that could be a sort of a theme for tonight that we could keep coming back to. But first of all, I wanted to begin with you, Lee. As the editor of Split, what were you looking for in contributions, and what type of collection were you trying to build?
Well, thank you, Cass. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I just will say briefly that I can't take credit for the theme of this anthology. I wish I could. It's a great theme, because who has not had some kind of endings? At the very, very least, if we are totally boring people, we will leave our youth behind at some point. But it actually was our publisher, Jane Curry from Ventura, who came and suggested this topic to me, and I got very excited. Now, I got excited because, as I was saying before, it's a very potentially dramatic topic, but I also was very excited because I have been feeling for a long time now that there was something I wanted to say about endings, about how we as a society discuss endings, because I mean, humans will always love telling stories with happy endings, and I personally love happy endings too. But I think because we live at the moment in such a therapeutic culture, with so much sort of pop psychology around us, embedded in the everyday until we don't even think about it, I think often as pop psychology. I think we kind of got into the habit of expecting any story of ending, especially even if it's a very, very difficult, traumatic perhaps story of ending, we expect the stories to be told in a way that reassures the listeners or the viewers or the readers. We expect them to be redemptive. So it's actually an expectation among publishers, I've noticed as well. When I work with publishers and I, for example, offer something, they often would ask me, and what will the reader get out of it at the end? Will they have some kind of wisdom to take from this? And this is all, I understand the impulse for happy ending. I'm into happy endings myself, but I just think that when we dress the stories in this way, what we do, we create a storytelling map, which is misleading. And it's very easy to believe that if you went through some kind of difficult experience, I don't know, it can be cancer, can be losing somebody you love, can be the end of relationship with a country, for example, where you can't go back for some reason. You kind of feel that if you did not come on the other end of this loss as a better person, or as as a tougher person, or at least if you didn't learn some lessons, I don't like the word lessons either, but then if you didn't do all that, you failed in some way. And what I wanted to do in this book is to create a map of different types of stories where people lost or left something behind and they became better for that, stories where they did not become better for that, and also, which I think most of the stories are in the book like this, stories of ambivalence, because often we want to lose something, often we want to leave something behind, we want to say move to a different city or leave a particular lover, but once we do it and we gain what we wanted, there's also price to pay often. So there's a lot of ambivalence in the book. And last thing I'll say is that what was really important to me also is to try and tackle the topic of endings in as diverse way as possible. So when we think about endings, we often think about endings of relationships, which is what a lot of our contributors, including myself actually, wrote about. But there's other types of endings. So we have Sami Shah, for example, who wrote about leaving behind religion of his birth, Islam, or we have Graeme Simsion, who argues that he left behind certain personal characteristics that he deliberately chose to discard. And Ramona had a very interesting take on our theme, and Kate Holden's take on the theme is completely different to all other contributors, but I won't say anymore because that's their stories to tell.
Thank you, Lee. And you explain that actually really well in your introduction to the book, that that balance between redemptive endings versus narratives that sort of leave us with a feeling of failure or loss, and why it's important to talk about all of those kinds of stories and different endings. What surprised you most about the essays that you received?
I think what surprised me the most is that some contributors talked about these sort of internal endings, like the example of Graeme Simsion, but also, for example, Damon Young, the philosopher and children's writer, he argues in his essay that he decided to leave the child that he was behind. He no longer attached or kind of relate himself to his childhood because he had a difficult childhood with abusive father, and he argues this that he's better off for this, which is kind of goes again very much against all the grain of the psychological wisdoms or so-called received wisdoms that we live around. But you know, you have to process your childhood, you have to incorporate all your younger self within yourself. And although I've never myself experienced anything like this, I'm always very attached to everything in my past. But I was really excited to see this take on what it means, what you can actually do. And another thing that really surprised me was that almost nobody said no to me when I approached them with this topic, even though anthologists, as probably those of you who are writers know, they don't pay much money. And I approached writers I really love, who are successful, who are busy, and I think it's just this theme that really sort of resonated with people.
Because you're such a nice person too, Lee. They couldn't say no to you.
Oh, no, I just put a knife and
the threats work. No, I agree with you about Damon Young's piece. It's very personal and very strongly presented, and kind of different to how, as you said, to how you think you would normally process your childhood. So it's an interesting piece. Were there any common themes in the submissions that you got?
Well, I kind of knew it's the second anthology that I edited, and I tend to be quite a prescriptive editor because I really, really always care about diversity. I myself don't like reading collections where stories too much sort of echo each other. So I negotiated from the very start with every author what they're going to write about to avoid repetition. But as I suspected, we did have a lot of stories about a romantic relationship, which is great. So for example, but there were so many interesting, very different takes on romantic relationships. So for example, one of the contributors that you and I discussed, Cass, but you really loved your essay, Virginia Peters, who is also with us today. So Virginia, for example, wrote a very interestingly structured tale of the relationship of her daughter, her first sort of serious boyfriend that she had, and his betrayal, with the betrayal of a friend of Virginia and her husband, how he betrayed the family. And so this is a very, I think, unusual take on sort of a story of romance gone badly. And Kate Goldsworthy, who is also with us in the audience today, she wrote about romantic relationship from, again, very different angles. So she wrote about the end, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting the author, but the way I read her essay, and we discussed it, I think, she wrote about the end of her heterosexual identity, about coming out, but really it's sort of the end when you emerge and you begin as somebody else.
Yeah, there's certainly some fabulous essays, and as you say, the Virginia Peters one was really one that touched me, really resonated with me personally. But you know, all of them I think have something to offer. Look, we'll come back to your essay in a moment, but first I want to go back to Ramona. Ramona, your essay entitled Goodbye and Good Luck asks the question, can you love a corporation? And it explores your long association and then your split with the ABC. Could you tell us a bit about the genesis of your essay and what you wanted to convey through writing it?
Well, when Lee asked me whether I'd like to write something and could I think of a split, I mean, you know, we've a lot of people have had splits and, you know, divorces and relationships, but that was a relationship, probably the longest relationship I've ever had, was with the corporation. And I thought, well, and it was probably, what was it, 7 years after I'd left Lee? I think, well, it's 9 years now. So I thought by then I was perhaps ready to think about it. And, you know, this corporation had been part of my life from when I was a tiny kid, because we didn't have television, we had a radio on top of the fridge, and you turned it on.
What were some of your earliest memories of the ABC?
Kindergarten of the air. Are you sitting comfortably? Yes, so then we will begin. And then there was, you know, here we go loopy-loo, here we go loopy. I didn't even know what the words were because my parents didn't speak English properly. But you know how you sort of have this, you've got the wrong words going through. But that was my entertainment, that was my education. And of course at school, we had the ABC broadcast in the classrooms for various, you know, things. So that was like, it was like, I think I described it as like an imprinting mechanism, like Konrad Lorenz did these experiments where if the little ducklings saw Konrad Lorenz as the first thing that they saw when they were hatched, that was their mother. And that was the kind of relationship I had with this corporation. You know, it was my information, it was my education. And then, you know, as I grew up and, you know, I wasn't a journalist straight away, I was a scientist, and then I was, you know, a freelancer. But suddenly this idea that you would go into this hallowed place, and that's what I did when I was probably in my, you know, early 30s. That was the first time I got a full-time job there. And it was unbelievable. It was like being in this super place where I only imagined. It was like inside the radio. I was actually there. And I learned a lot, and I was taught a lot by fabulous people, and I was given, you know, a chance to spread my wings. And, you know, sometimes I flew off the end of very high buildings with my wings, and it was a bit dangerous, but, you know, it was exciting. So that was the sort of beginning of my relationship. And so I began to think about loving a corporation, defending a corporation. You know, I was on the board, I was a staff elected director, so I was going into battle like some kind of Boadicea character. And I was defending this important institution, and then things went very wrong.
Yeah, you say in the book, actually, there is a moment when you realise a relationship is over. What was that moment for you, and what did that subsequent split mean for you?
The moment well, you know, at one point somebody who said to me, but why do you need to read so many books? I'm talking about a manager here. But why do you need to read so many books? I mean, lots of people do interviews without reading books, you know. Why do you need to read them? And I just thought, who am I speaking with here? I didn't recognize the person as the kind of person who would listen to the show. And I think they didn't listen to the show. But, you know, I suddenly thought, oh, I'm on the wrong planet. I thought I was somewhere else, and I realized I'm somewhere removed from where I thought I was.
In your essay, you also quote Ovid. You say, "Be patient and tough. One day this pain will be useful to you." And I suspect that this resonates with many creative non-fiction and fiction writers too. Ramona, how can we best harness pain or emotional rejection or failure or abandonment to fuel our writing?
You have to sit with it. You know, you have to wait. I'm really not a very patient person. I've learnt patience, not very well sometimes, but you just have to wait till it's cooked. You know, I don't think I could have written that essay 3 years after I left or 6 years after I left. But 7, I began to get a perspective on it. And also because when I left the ABC, I went to be a writer, I got a 2-book deal with a publisher, and I began to change myself. And instead of working on other people's work and talking to them and being completely enmeshed in them, I decided to give myself a chance to think about what I wanted to think about and to spend my days over there at my desk. Nobody cared whether I was there or not. Nobody heard my voice. Nobody saw me falter. Nobody heard anything. I just got some time to see what I could come up with. And it's been a great gift to me. And, you know, now with the 3rd book about to be published in a couple of months that I've written over there and not in the public eye and you know, in midst of everything. But I had to sit with the difference and learn how to be somebody else. And I think that's really the secret. You just have to wait till it's ready to
Time.
Time.
Yeah. And it sounds like that's been quite a liberating or freeing sort of experience for you too, being able to work in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I want to move on to Kate Holden. Thank you, Ramona. But before I do that, I've just noticed that Virginia Peters has only just entered the room. So you didn't slip in unnoticed, Virginia. We saw you. And I just wanted to mention that we were all talking before about your fabulous essay and how it resonated very deeply with me. And again, saying a big hello to you and Kate Goldsworthy, who are contributors to this book as well, but not on the panel tonight, but great essays as well. So Kate Holden, your story called Clinging stands out as being quite different from the other essays because it relates to holding on and accumulating and treasuring possessions and people rather than splitting from them.
I'm sorry,
Can you
Kate,
tell us?
Kate is on mute.
Oh, I'm on mute?
No, Kate.
Oh, Kate. Kate, are you with us?
Yes. Am I there? Thank you. Sorry.
Ah, there she is. Fabulous. Okay, did you hear my question?
I did.
My question is, can you tell us what drove you to write this particular essay that is so different from everything else really in the collection?
I feel a bit self-conscious now. I wasn't driven to write. I was beguiled by Lee, who, when she suggested it to me, she said, "Would you like to contribute?" I just said, "You're asking the wrong person," because I'm not really into leaving anything. I'm such a hoarder and a clinger. And she said, "Great, you know, well, let's have that perspective." And so I did write a piece which is about, well, I was going to say about my fear of losing things, but it's really a questioning of whether it's a fear of losing things or a kind of a graceful acceptance that you do accumulate as you live. And my understanding, which I've inherited probably from my family, that life is a process of accretion and you can't ever really shed anything. You know, I talk about how as we grow, we gain microbes and memories and, you know, texture on our skins and so on. So for me, the idea of relinquishing doesn't quite make sense, because when is anything truly gone? And for me, it's expressed perhaps though in an anxiety, which is that I collect a lot of things. I like to collect things and I don't like to give them away. I collect mementos, you know, I collect archives and documentation. I take photographs.
I was going to ask you what sort of material things you collect.
Oh, little kind of, I know there's some great Yiddish words for this. I just collect stuff, you know, I collect, you know, stones on the beach and old postcards in flea markets and wine bottles from a place I've been that had a nice little wine, the cork. And my house, well, you know, I'm renting a place at the moment, so it's interesting. I don't have so much stuff around, but my house where I was before was just this kind of, Darwin did some experiments with worms and found that they collect little leaves and flower petals and line their burrows very carefully and idiosyncratically. And my home is like that for me. It's a place for which I line with all the things that make me me. And so I started writing about this, you know, the most obvious thing, the hoarding. Not that I'm a hoarder, it's a storage problem. But, you know, this, you know, this desire to keep collecting evidence of who I am and what I've done, where I've been. And then looking behind that, if there's any apprehension, you know, is there some reason why I'm afraid to let things go and have them forgotten? And then I thought about my upbringing and how my family was also, you know, a family that liked to collect, and almost an animist feeling about possessions. So when I was a little girl, I couldn't bear anything to be thrown out, even little old shopping receipts and the cigarette papers from my mother's packet of smoke. So I'd go into the rubbish bin and filch them all out and stash them behind the piano because I didn't want them to be injured. You know, I felt responsible and protective, as if everything has a soul, you know, and that's obviously a little bit deranged, but I think I still have that sense of the universe being a sympathetic, soulful place. And so my accumulating of things is partly memorial and memento, and it's partly kind of custodianship, and a sense of responsibility. I then thought about what happened when I was a heroin addict and I had nothing. So for 5 years, I was a heroin addict and I had almost no possessions. I had no money. I lost everything that I'd had, at least most of it temporarily. And that was both a constructive process and a kind of a great loss. And while it helped me remake myself, I returned harder than ever. So when I started earning money and having a house again, out came my impulse to collect. So for me, I guess it was also a restoration. And so letting go, splitting, would mean splitting from myself in some way, which is something I find difficult to do.
Yeah, I was going to say that you're, you know, you've been very open in your previous memoirs about your history and your life so far, and I wondered whether the experience that you've had has changed the way that you view holding on versus letting go to things. And I guess I'm thinking about the times when you had nothing.
Well, I found it frightening, to be honest, and I think it was because I didn't really grieve the loss of my stuff because I was far more concerned with survival and more existential terror. But the two things became associated because what I found is that you could be, for example, a loved and intelligent and, you know, cherished person as I was, and yet you can fall off the edge, you know, and ultimately no one could save me, no one else could follow me. And so that the loneliness and the dislocation and the sense of being completely kind of rinsed of every connection, which is frightening, kind of really stayed with me. I think that you could just find yourself out on the street in the dark and no one would not only notice that you were gone, but very few people, it felt at the time, would even care. So for me, I guess it's a reparation, it's a restoration thing, to place myself in a place, a community, with relationships, with things, with people, and I appreciate them. You know, I just really cherish those connections. Of course, I've had, you know, things finish and end and pass on, but I like to think that they're still with me somehow.
I was really fascinated in the story by your mental shift once you had a child. And I wanted to ask you, how has being a mother affected your idea of clinging to items associated with your child?
God, I'm a shocking hoarder of child memorabilia now as well. Yes, look, I talk in the essay about how you know, obviously most of us collect mementos, locks of hair and, you know, baby teeth, or, you know, a couple of pajamas, which tiny little pajamas or something. But I guess when my child was born and young, I found it so implausible that I had a child. I think I was in a deep shock that this had actually happened. I was thrilled, but it seemed amazing to me that I kept expecting him to evaporate somehow and no longer be. And obviously, thinking it through, the only way that would actually happen once he was born was that if he died. And so I constantly lived in this apprehension that he would just vaporize away somehow, and all the evidence of him and all my love connection with him would also. So I started rather morbidly keeping everything. And then I found that I was preemptively imagining how much I would need these things later on when he was gone. And I realized that was kind of a bit weird and anxious. But so I've kind of toned it down, to be honest. There's only, I mean, he's 7 now, and there's only so much storage you can have for baby clothes and old toys. I realized that you can just take a photograph of the toys, and it's really the idea of the toy. You don't need a huge teddy bear. You just need to remember that it existed.
It was there.
Yeah, but for me, it was kind of a melancholy turn, I guess. At the same time, embodying the idea that I was externalizing into the love that you have for your child, and how you do feel like you've kind of gone out of your own self and you're now a bigger person. And that was applied to the body of my kid, but also to the body of the things that he was involved in.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way of expressing it. Thank you. Lee, I wanted to come back to you for a moment. Your essay called Bruised is a dark tale of passion, violence, desire, and how we can allow ourselves to be subsumed by another. It begins and ends with dark flowers blooming on your arms. Tell us about Bruised.
I think I like this description. Can I steal it?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, basically, it's the way I kind of thought about this story. There's 2 levels there. So on one level, it's a story on a very sort of basic kind of dramatic level. It is a story of me at a younger age getting into a completely wrong relationship with where all the signs were up there, but the man I was about to maybe even move in together with was violent. And I, at the same time, the irony was, but at the same time, I was a social work student. I was in my mid-20s. I was living in Tel Aviv, working in one of the roughest neighborhoods of Tel Aviv as a social work student, working with a lot of domestic violence survivors, and getting very good marks for my essays based on my work. And I just could not see from but I was doing exactly what I was supposedly the educated social work kind of person, the writer, was getting into. So it's a bit, so this is the sort of dramatic level. So it's a story of getting into this very wrong relationship, missing all the signs, and then coming out of it eventually. Basically, it was a really dangerous situation. The man, when I finally tried to leave this man, he kidnapped me, and I don't know where I would have ended if not. Luckily, I kind of managed to escape. But on a deeper, so this is sort of the colorful action of the story. But on a deeper level, for me, really, this is a story about a double limbo where I lived in my mid-20s when I was stuck in a relationship before this. So this man actually helped me to end that limbo. That's the irony of the story. But something really bad and dark had to happen to me to actually make a very positive, to end something not good for me and to begin something good. So before I met him, I was stuck in a relationship that led nowhere. I was also stuck geographically. I lived in Tel Aviv then, and I loved this city passionately. Like Ramona, who said before that her biggest sort of strongest relationship, longest at least relationship, not strongest, but longest relationship to this date was with a corporation. My most passionate relationship at that time of my life, in my mid-20s, was not with men, even though I had quite a few relationships. My most passionate relationship was with a city. I loved Tel Aviv dearly. I was completely smitten by this city that was vibrant and smart and sassy and very dangerous for me too in many ways. And so I was kind of didn't know what to do, whether I should leave the city or not, whether I should leave the man I was with. And really what I wanted to sort of to explore in this story is how sometimes you can get into a bad situation, but actually this bad situation can be good for you. Because if I did not have that shock of finding myself in a relationship I never thought I would find myself in, I would probably continue that limbo for much longer. And at the end of this story, basically, I live Tel Aviv as well, and I come to Melbourne.
And it took you 2 decades to write that story, which I imagine, took a lot of strength. It's taken you 20 years to be able to put those words on the page. What can you see about that time in your life now that you couldn't see 20 years ago?
One of the most interesting things I found in writing this essay is that when I started writing it, I had that moralistic redemptive impulse inside me. That same kind of impulse I kind of was condemning in before. I really wanted to write the kind of politically correct story of a young woman who, you know, gets into this sort of really like dangerous situation with a man who is not good for her, and then she prevails, and now much smarter, and I'm much tougher, and I know much better. So I wanted this sort of happy ending. And when I started writing this work, it took me a long time. It took me 2 decades to write it because it was really difficult to revisit that essay. Because when I got kidnapped, basically it was a kind of near-death experience, in a way. Maybe I'm a bit dramatizing, but it was scary. It was frightening. I didn't know whether I'll kind of come out alive from that night. So it took me a really long time because I didn't want to go to that space of that sort of park. I was held in a park at night time, in a cold night. But what I found interesting when I did manage to go into all that space is that telling this story excited me. It excited me in a way that it made me feel alive. I remembered really vividly how alive I felt during that time, even though I was in a difficult relationship. I mean, the man basically, until that time when he kidnapped me, he never did anything physically violent to me. He was emotionally abusive and difficult, but there was nothing at all of this sort of stuff before. Although it was a short relationship. We've been only together for 4 months, and I don't know what would have happened if I overstayed, which I could have. But it was really interesting to relive that excitement. And the excitement that I relived was not just of the initial days of our relationship, but also of my passion for Tel Aviv. I remembered how much I loved that city. I remembered how much I felt alive, and I did not manage to give myself a kind of correct, happy, redemptive ending, because what I discovered by writing this is that even though I am married now, I have children, I live a much more sort of, we would say, sensible life. I don't drink and smoke like I used to, at least don't drink to such extent. But I actually discovered when writing it, with somewhere deep inside me, there is still this excitable person who loves the darkness. And I actually discovered also that I'm not necessarily want to lose that person, but I like, to some extent, this part of me.
Well, much of your writing, I think, generally conjures up that dichotomy of pain and pleasure, fear and eroticism, shame and pride, all of those sort of things that seem opposite. Why are those emotions so connected, and how is it that we often can't experience one without the other?
Yeah, this is a very good big questions which I try to explore especially in my first book in English, The Dangerous Bride, when I write about my trials and errors of non-monogamy. I think a lot of the people, I'm not sure I'm the only one here, but definitely in my experience, I've always lived with this two completely contrary desires. I've always wanted to feel secure. Always wanted to be loved and to have some kind of home, secure base. But I also always wanted to go out into the adventure. I think the darkness, and darkness doesn't have to be about love or sex. It can be many other things. It can be just venturing into places where hold some kind of risk that something can happen to you. I think those situations, they really sort of bring us sometimes to this animal state, which is a state that is a civilized, especially, you know, like where I'm a sort of, you know, more middle class kind of educated community, we really sort of often suppress. And we suppress it for a good reason. I would not want to relive that relationship that I had, and it was hard to write this essay as well. But we do pay the price, I think, for suppressing, or at least I pay this price, because the allure of the unknown is very strong. It's like, I guess what I kind of trying to write about in whatever else I write, I try to stuff write. I always think about those. The bigger question that I have in my mind is, how should I live my life? And I haven't found an answer yet. But I think I try to live my life, and maybe that's why I write. I like to live somewhere in between. I don't want too much light. I don't want too much darkness. but you can't really find this balance. So I kind of swing back and forth, and I think writing sort of helps me to be somewhere in this kind of swinging middle.
Yeah, I think you explore that really well in this story, and also I think the your obvious love affair for Tel Aviv shines through really well too. So it's a beautiful story, as they all are in this collection. The writing in this collection is consistently of a really high quality. As we said before, there's so many other talented writers that have contributed to the collection. Alice Pung, A.S. Patrick, Peter Bishop, Kate Goldsworthy, Damon Young, Fiona Wright, Graeme Simsion, Mafanoe Jones, just to name a few. I wanted to ask each of you, and we might start with you, Ramona, which essay, other than your own, was your favourite?
Oh, that's unfair. That's terrible. I can't tell you. I can't give you an answer. And
all right, we'll come back. We'll come back to you.
No, because I haven't read the whole book
Okay.
since I first read it, since it first came out, which is how long ago now, Lee?
A year.
A year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can't. In all honesty, I wouldn't be able to answer you.
Okay. All right. We'll give you a pass. We'll give you a pass.
Thank you.
Kate, do you have a particular one that you liked?
Well, the one that I think I remember best is Graeme Simsion's piece. I was really struck by the aching honesty and vulnerability that he put into that piece. And it was such an interesting one. It didn't go where I thought it was going to go. And I really appreciated this idea, notwithstanding what I was saying about, you don't really let go of anything in your life, but his kind of shame and mortification at his earlier self and his forgiving of himself. I find that always a very incredibly powerful move in a story, when people find a way to be tender to themselves. And he just found it seemed to me, an account of reconciliation, and in a sense, again, in that he took something else on. He took this chance to be tender and to forgive himself, and for how he'd been asked to see himself as a child and who he had become as a man.
Yeah, it is a beautiful, beautiful essay. Lee, what about you? That's probably very unfair to ask you as the editor, but do you have one that you would perhaps like to speak about that we haven't talked about so far?
Okay, I'll take it in this way, because otherwise, it's like asking me which one of my sons I love more.
Yeah. What's your favourite child? Who's your favourite child?
I'll just mention this. Thank you. That's a very lovely way of putting it. I'll just mention a couple maybe who we didn't mention before. I think Dimitri Kakmi wrote a really interesting essay which spoke to me on many levels, because he wrote about his divorce from Turkey, the country of his birth. And that's a topic which is, of course, really speaks to me, because I left two countries, first Russia, then Israel, and I have interesting relationships with them. With Russia, at least, I have a very ambivalent relationship. And so I think it's a very interesting take on his feelings towards Turkey, because it's a very, very passionate love affair. Really, whatever people live in this book, in a lot of the stories, that's a recurring thing. They're really passionate about what they leave behind. And that was one of the things I actually was sort of asking the contributors initially, is to write about something that really has changed them in some way. And Dimitri beautifully describes this sort of really passionate love he had for Turkey, so passionate when he couldn't love Australia for many years when he lived there, and only after he tore his Turkish passport, and I won't tell why, you'll have to read the essay, but only after he tore the Turkish passport, he suddenly rediscovered Australia and fell in love with this country. And another, mention one more essay, Peter Bishop's essay. Peter Bishop, he means a lot to me personally. He is the former director of Varuna, the writer's house in Blue Mountains, where I spent many very meaningful weeks. And I know that Kate also been there. Ramona, have you visited in Varuna?
Oh, I did a story about it when I was a journalist.
That's right. Actually, I was one of your interviewees for that. That's how we met first. So anyway, so Peter is my kind of what I call informal mentor, and I was very excited when he agreed to contribute to this collection, because he helped so many writers around Australia, so many of us he encouraged, but he hardly ever sort of had time for his own writing. And he wrote a really interestingly structured and very, very poetic essay about losing two friends, a mother and a daughter. A mother, both died, mother because of Alzheimer, and her daughter committed suicide just after her mother's death because she couldn't live without her mother. And sort of the essay is not just about their friendship, but it's also about these two women, the very codependent relationship they had. And it's also, but as always with Peter, he can't just write about one thing. It's about the friendship, it's about death, but it's about Alzheimer, but it's also about Mayakovsky. And it's also about Poland, and it's also about writing and Chekhov. And anyway, it's really his sort of hallmark of putting everything in every work he writes.
Yeah, that was a great one as well. Yeah. I think the thing that really struck me about this collection was its absolute honesty and vulnerability. When I wrote a review, I wrote, "Rarely do you come across a book in which the authors so brutally slice open their chests and reveal their beating hearts." And that's really what I felt when I was reading this. The truth and the exposure of the stories is uncomfortable and disquieting, but somehow it's also reassuring, perhaps because it does allow us such familiarity with others' pain and mistakes and trauma. Now that leads me to a question that we actually had put up on the Facebook promotion before this event tonight, a question from Jessica Gildersleeve. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And she wanted to know, how do you approach the writing of personal traumas? And do you ask or expect different things of yourself than you would if you were interviewing someone else? So would any of you like to comment on that?
Well, perhaps I should start. I've interviewed a few people over the years, and I think writing, you just owe it to the reader to give everything you can, at least in the first draft. You know, I think you have to write as if this is it, you know, and then you can, you know, if you want to pull back a bit, or if you want to be a bit more diplomatic or something like that. But I mean, what's the point? I mean, you're trying to convey something of an important moment, and that's the thing about human beings, is that, you know, we're very similar in lots of ways, and you learn about other humans that they often have the same kind of fears and shame and all of the things that Lee was talking about before. They have pain, and they learn, and and sharing these things is what makes us human. We need each other. We need each other's stories. We need each other's support. We need to recognize ourselves in the other's eyes. And that's what I think we owe the reader. If we're going to bother telling a story like this, you may as well tell it properly.
Beautiful answer. Thank you, Ramona. Kate, what do you think? Do you think writing about yourself, you expect different things than when you interview other people about their stories?
Yeah, when I interview people who've had a difficult time, I try to tread very gently and, you know, and open the opportunities for them, but I would never force them through the door. But I think it's possibly harder to talk about trauma in conversation with a stranger than to write about it, you know, in the privacy of your room. And when I started writing my first publishable work, which was my memoir, In My Skin, it was later described for its brutal honesty, but I think it was also my naivety. I just didn't think anyone was going to read it. So I put it all on the page, and I also...
It was very raw.
It was very raw, but it was also a refusal to be ashamed. And as Ramona says, I just expected that I was not the only person that had ever been fearful, fallible, vulnerable, foolish, and that readers would trust it. And I just have such respect for other humans that I think that they can probably take it and be generous in return. Yeah. Love the reading.
Lee, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say I joined Kate and Ramona, but I just want to make, yeah, it would definitely be harder on myself than on somebody else I'm interviewing. But I just want to make a quick distinction between writing from trauma, which is really painful and raw, and writing about something that you're ashamed or feel uncomfortable about. So the reason I couldn't write for 20 years about that story, that relationship, is not because I was ashamed of what happened. I was, because of course, how could I be in that relationship and, you know, and all that sort of stuff. But I just, it hurt too much when I went into that sort of the ending of it, especially. And that's why I didn't write, because I don't believe in writing from the wound. It's not my words, by the way, somebody else said, I can't remember who, but write from the wound, from the scar, not from the wound. If anyone here knows who said it, please do tell me. So I just had to wait basically for 20 years until I felt it's not just self-care, it's also care of my readers, because I think if I don't have enough distance, then I'm not going to tell a good enough story. I'm not going to be objective. I'm going to sort of do my own things for my own sort of therapeutic outburst, as opposed to actually making art from it.
So what do you think binds this collection together so closely, the three of you, after reading the stories, contributing your own stories? What do you think is the one thing that really brings it together?
I think the cover is fantastic. This image, this image of split. And when I saw that, I could see that, you know, there's something visceral about that. You know, it looks like skin, and it does look like a wound. And I thought, you know, that it really penetrates. And I think all of the essays kind of penetrate, and that's what ties them together. They're different moments, they're different kinds of stories, but they're all the ones that, you know, everyone takes a deep breath before, I'll tell you this one. Okay, I'll tell you this. And then it begins. And that's how I think they're tied together.
Yeah, I'd agree. Kate or Lee, do you want to comment on that? Or
yeah, look, for me, I guess yes, it's a sense of reflection, and maybe it is writers' ability to focus on a particular moment, an incident, find the prismatic moment that tells us whole story. There was this one thing, and then use that to work outwards. You know, that's our job, isn't it? To find the little bits and then, you know,
unravel it.
Yeah.
I think Ramona and Kate put it so beautifully. I'll only add just one little thing. Well, it's a big thing for me, but it's a little to what they already said. Is I think my sense is, working with the contributors, that everybody who wrote for this book wrote about something that in some way changed them a bit, or at least lingered in them, and kind of left a footprint on their soul. And I'm sorry about my Russian hyperbolic language.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Thank you, Lee. Now we're going to go to questions soon, if we have any from the audience. But first of all, I want to quickly ask you, I know that each of you has a new book coming out soon, as I mentioned. Ramona, would you like to share with us what yours is about first? And then we'll do a quick little intro to all three of them.
Well, I noticed a few years ago that we were, as human beings, in a pretty interesting place on this planet. Global warming was happening. Things were getting a little bit complicated. And now, of course, we have a global pandemic. And I was really interested to know, as a human being, what my fellow human beings were capable of. Are we able to get together and work a way out of this situation? How did we get to be like this? Was there anything about our history, anything about our evolution that would give me clues about how we developed to be like we are? and then what we could think about, you know, in terms of the future. So this is a little piece of paper with my new cover on it because it's been printed at the moment. It's called A Letter to Layla, Travels to Our Deep Past and Our Near Future. And there's lots of conversations and there's lots of, you know, explorations about robots in Berlin and a festival against death in California, and looking at paleoarchaeology in Georgia, in the Republic of Georgia, and exploring Ice Age caves in France, and talking to some of the most interesting minds in the world to try and work out what makes us human and what might be in store for us.
That's absolutely fascinating. Cannot wait for that. Kate, what have you been working on?
Oh, well, nothing quite as magnificent. Gosh, no, my next book is called The Winter Road, and it's I'm writing about the murder of environmental officer Glenn Turner, who was killed by a farmer that he was investigating for environmental crimes, and he was shot in the back by a farmer on a twilit country road, and the whole book is about why the farmer felt he was entitled to do that, why we had an environmental officer, such a person in the world, and the very long histories behind those two kind of mentalities that had this fatal encounter. Yes, and onwards to the future.
So true crime?
Yeah, kind of true crime, but not in the emphasis isn't on the crime, it's on the, you know, on the bigger story.
Oh, that sounds great as well. Wonderful.
Excellent. It's
and when is that coming out?
It's going to be coming out in March.
March. Yeah. Great. And finally, Lee, what are you working on next?
Just before I say this, I just want to quickly say that I had the privilege of reading Ramona's book, and as a sneak peek preview. And I just think it's amazing. You just can't, I came out of reading her book, just my head was buzzing with ideas. And I just, you don't know this, Ramona, but as a follow-up to your book, I grabbed other books, but I wanted to read because you opened my curiosity about all sorts of things, especially the prehistorical society. And I know quite a lot about Kate's book too, and can't wait for the release. Mine is still very much work in progress. I'm working on a book on writing. And I know there's lots of books on writing already out there. So I was thinking hard, what can I bring to it? Can I bring anything to it? And I'm trying to. So my angle is I'm looking at how the concept of emotional honesty can hopefully useful to writers, of course on the page, but also in the process how they work on the books. And it's called Into the Flames.
Oh, that sounds fantastic as well. And that's one for all of us. We can all use that book. Great. Emma, Kate, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we do. We've got a couple. We also have a comment. Josephine's pointed out that it's Sisonke Masiming, whose quote that is that you mentioned, Lee.
Thank you.
And the first question that we had is from Ross, and it's for Ramona. Ross would like you to elaborate, if you could, on your comment earlier about waiting till it's cooked, the suffering in our lives, Ramona.
Well, how will I elaborate on that? Well, because, you know, things happen to us and we feel them, we respond to them, we bury them. We put them over there. We don't look at them. We shut them in the wardrobe. We don't want to look there. And sometimes it just takes a while before we can open them up and say, well, what have we here? And sometimes you say, oh, is that all there is? It's like that old, you know, that song. Is that all there is? You can actually learn to look at whatever it is from all these different angles, and you can get its kind of measure. In a way, it seems so big, and then when it's cooked a bit, when it's ready to eat, God, all the mixed metaphors. What a mess of potage. when it's ready, then you can be reasonable about it and really understand what it is and learn from it and see what you couldn't see before. I guess that's what I meant by that. I hope that makes sense, Ross.
Lovely, thank you. We have another question from Indira for Kate. What you said about letting go is interesting, the fact that you find it hard. Isn't writing a cathartic experience of letting go, or do you treat it as an emotional reserve to keep the creativity in you alive?
Oh, really such a thoughtful question. Look, I keep a diary, and I always have. And I guess for me, writing is a memorializing practice in a way. To write something is to, inscribe it and get it out of yourself, get it out of your fallible memory and into, at least on a screen, onto a page, a document that might survive. It's a testimony. I think I write memoirs often, and I do a lot of teaching of memoirs, and I know people have a very strong urge to document things and to put things in writing and express them and share them. So for me, I don't find writing cathartic as such. I find it exciting, and I get a big charge when I write something, especially if it is about an experience that was true and strong. Maybe it's a little bit dangerous, but I guess I think of it as putting it out somewhere safe where it might survive and take on an even longer life. That's the hope.
Thank you. Because I'm conscious of the time, we've got several more questions coming through, and lots of people saying thank you for a brilliant conversation tonight. So before I hand back to you all, I'll ask one more question if you're happy to stick around for a few extra minutes. The question is from Warren, and Warren says, what do you do about the issue of including the names and stories of other people in your memoir? So that's for everybody.
Well,
I think sorry, you go.
Well, I was just going to say, you have to be so careful, not least because we have some of the strongest defamation laws in this country that exist in the world, and people's feelings, obviously. But on the other hand, you have to tell a story. There are many strategies that people use, none of them quite satisfactory. But I do believe that if you have a story, you're entitled to tell your part of the story with responsibility. I don't know what everyone else thinks, Ramona, Lee.
Well, my last book was called Bloodhound, Searching for My Father. And that was, it's a story about trying to find out the identity of the man who I believe to be my real father, and discovering that my dad, the one that my mother's husband, wasn't my real father. And it's also a story of names and identities and quite a lot of dead people. And I then alive people, a part of people who were in my family, my sister. She didn't really want to be named because she does a certain job and she doesn't want people to, it was important for her not to be identified with me and my story because of the sort of work she does. So I didn't name her. But I did name others, and I just had to make a decision about whether the naming was important for the story. And when it was, I did it. And when it wasn't, I didn't. But the story was the most important thing. And, writers are, murderers, as we know. You have to be really... you have to understand what you're doing, and you have to, for me, the work has to be the important thing. I mean, I don't mean you can go around throughout your life being terrible to people and cruel and, all of that. So you have to be very careful about what stories you're going to tell. But once you decide to tell a story, if it's important to you, and for that, it was my story. I mean, I was at the center of it. Who is my father, and why don't I know who he is, and what are the clues? And all the people were dead. And how do you tell a story when all the people who are witnesses are gone? So that was the kind of conundrum. And I thought that was an important story. And other people's feelings, I thought, well, if it's just a matter of being ashamed, I just thought that was that wasn't a good enough feeling for me to not tell my story. Because I thought that shame was something I think we really need to let go of, all of us, really. It's in lots of ways. So I wouldn't tell a story which would cause real pain and damage to people, but if people were a little bit ashamed, I just thought I could live with that.
And I would just like to add to this that I think the marriage between writing really good literature, I'm talking about, artistic literature, and being a decent person is not an easy marriage. It's not always possible. And I think as writers, we always have sort of to make this two-way loyalty to people around us versus the loyalty to our readers. So if there's too much we can't put or don't dare to put or to worry about offending, we may as well just not write the book. But there are ways to get around it. And I'll just quickly say with one of my ground rules to myself when I write about, not people I interviewed, but people who just were in my life. My ground rule is tell your story, not their secrets. So if I, for example, have a character, in real person, of course, but character in my work who I know some details about this person that can be embarrassing for them, but will add very vivid, entertaining value to my story, but won't really change the essence of what I want to tell. I won't use them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good advice. I think the writer Anne Lamott said, tell your story. If others wanted you to write more warmly about them, they should have behaved better.
Lovely, thank you. Well, unfortunately, that's all that we have time for this evening. I've had a few more questions. I'm getting loads of comments thanking you all. So I'm going to take everybody off of mute now so oh wait, sorry. If you have
Sorry, can I just finish, Emma Kate, by saying thank you very much to all three of our panelists tonight. And just to reiterate again that Split is an absolutely unforgettable collection of well-crafted personal essays by some of Australia's most well-known authors who bare their souls in open and honest ways to share their stories with us. I highly recommend this book. And if the writing of any of these authors resonates with you, I recommend that you seek out their other writing for further, more in-depth reading.
And thank you. And I just want to quickly say big thank you for such a generous and thoughtful sharing.
Yes, thank you very much, Cass.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to take everybody off mute now so that you can join me. All right, you're all off mute. Thanks, everybody.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Oh, look at all those lovely faces. So nice to see everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And love to people in Melbourne, especially in the lockdown.
Yeah, love to Melbourne people.
Thank you.
Thank you.